You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Get your holidays started with the perfect tree in your perfect style from the Home Depot. Whether you want something that you can assemble in a few clicks, steal the show with over 2,000 color-changing bulbs, or a tree with lights that can be controlled by remote or foot pedal. The Home Depot has it all in our huge assortment of premium trees. Plus, get free delivery on over 2 million items this holiday from the Home Depot. Subject to availability. See homedepot.com/delivery for details.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 196, The Fall of France, The Myths of Dunkirk. This week, a big thank you goes out to Pierce for the donation and to Misal, Scott, Kyle, Tyler, and SM Callie for choosing to become members. You can find out more about becoming a member over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. The Dunkirk evacuations hold a special place in the history of the Second World War, particularly in Britain. The 330,000 British and French soldiers that were brought off the beaches and piers of Dunkirk far exceeded even the wildest hopes of the British leaders that ordered the evacuation to begin on May 26, 1940. Over the following 10 days, through the tremendous efforts of many groups of sailors, soldiers, and pilots, those evacuees were removed from their place in front of the German onslaught and taken back to either the United Kingdom or the French ports that were still outside of German control. In a war full of myths, Dunkirk is the epicenter of an entire genre of myths, which would begin to form almost immediately after the soldiers returned to the home islands. There would be multiple accounts of the battle published during the war years, often in a memoir style, and they were almost always pretty unreliable when it came to details, but were often pretty good at telling a good story. This is where you see the ideas like the little ships, the small civilian ships that would take part in the evacuation, play a major role due to their propaganda value. However, in quantitative terms, they played a relatively small role in the evacuation, only being present for a few days and not truly capable of bringing off as many men from the beaches as the Royal Navy could over the course of 10 days. The Royal Navy would assemble 40 destroyers to take part in Operation Dynamo, the code name for the operation, and it would be those destroyers and their crews that would play the pivotal role. But the stories are great. Little ships manned by common men doing hero stuff. Somebody should make a movie about it. But even those small boats were mostly crewed by sailors of the Royal Navy, and only a small percentage of them had civilians on board. The little ships are just one myth or one misconception among many, and we will talk about many of them along the course of the next few episodes. Then after the war, the events at Dunkirk started to be used or started to be talked about as some kind of almost victory, with one historian saying, quote, "This evacuation of Dunkirk is probably the greatest escape from disaster in all of history. Considering the performances of the preceding 2 weeks, it is amazing that forces so constantly in retreat could suddenly stiffen and hold during the crucial period of embarkation." End quote. As more information has come to light over the years, interpretations and understandings of Operation Dynamo have changed, and modern accounts lack some of the hyperbole and exaggeration that you might see in earlier efforts. But in some ways, that history of how the story has been told and understood is as important as the events themselves. Dunkirk and the Popular Memory of Britain at War, 1940-58, by Penny Summerfield, which I highly recommend anybody sort of go out there and read. It's free on JSTOR. You just have to set up an account and then you can read the article. Now, I'll put a link in the show notes. But anyway, Summerfield begins his article with this excellent quote. Quote, "The history of the contested inscription of Dunkirk in British culture emphasizes that at no point since the events occurred has the representation of the Second World War been secure. The popular memory of the war is continually subject to construction, contestation, and revision." End quote. I really like this quote also from Mark Connolly from his book, We Can Take It. Quote, "Few people have been bothered by the attempts to debunk the Dunkirk story. It is too entrenched in the national psyche. During the 60th anniversary celebrations in 2000, an editorial in the Daily Telegraph summed it up. Arguments on exactly what happened are hardly relevant and not worth arguing about," it noted, because although Dunkirk was a defeat, it was not one without heroes. For the British, Dunkirk is about heroism and a miracle. Others may wish to present all sorts of evidence to the contrary, but it cannot overtake what people know about the episode, because Dunkirk is taken as the entire history of the nation in miniature." End quote. Sometimes, events like Operation Dynamo are important not because of their impact on the war or their lack of impact on the war, but instead the value that is assigned to them by the participants and others within the nations that are involved, either at the time or in the generations that follow. I think that Dynamo is a really good example of this, and the miracle and the myths that have built up around it over the decades are one part of the important story. The next 2 episodes will discuss the events around the evacuation of Dunkirk, in the air, on the ground, and at sea. But it's also important to remember that the events at Dunkirk of May 26th to June 4th, while important, were also just one part of a much larger campaign that was kind of raging around them. For the British, Dunkirk is often seen as the beginning of the end of a disastrous adventure that had started on May 10th. But for the French, it was simply the beginning of the end, as their hopes of victory in Belgium came crashing down. And for the Germans, it seemed almost like a sideshow compared to the preparations for their attacks further into France. One of the major components of Operation Dynamo were the aerial efforts of the Royal Air Force. The French campaign had been a very hard time for the Royal Air Force, with the early efforts at bombing and close air support being incredibly costly in terms of overall aircraft. After just 5 days of the German offensive, the British had lost nearly 250 aircraft, either destroyed or damaged to the point where they had to be abandoned. The Germans had also captured most of the airfields that the RAF had been using in France. And with the beginning of Operation Dynamo, the pilots and aircraft-to-fighter command would be called upon to provide air support for the evacuation over its entire duration. This was quite a bit more difficult than you might imagine due to the fact that all of the fighter cover for the evacuation had to come from fighters based in southeast England. By May 26th, staging fighters out of England, then having them fly sorties over France, had become a bit more routine due to the fact that the Germans had been advancing so quickly that the British were hesitant to actually send more fighter squadrons onto the continent due to the simple concern that they would be captured or destroyed by German ground forces. This fear was combined with another fear that would be so impactful during the later stages of the French campaign. A fear that if the fighters were sent to France, there would not be enough for what would come after, namely the defense of the British Isles from German attack and invasion. These fears would result in cross-channel flying being an important part of British fighter activity during these parts of the campaign. Because of its location, the fighter support for Operation Dynamo fell to the 11th Fighter Group, commanded by Keith Park. The 11th would best be known for the central role that it would play during the Battle of Britain, but its actions against the Luftwaffe would begin during the events in France. From May 10th to May 26th, the group would lose 54 pilots over the course of 112 offensive patrols over France, which would leave it with just 200 aircraft to provide support over Dunkirk. And that was 200 aircraft at the start of the operation, and it was very well known that there were very limited replacements available, which meant the longer cross-channel patrols were happening, the fewer aircraft would be available due to simple mechanical attrition, not even considering enemy action. But support would still be provided over Dunkirk, and so the pilots would just have to deal with some of the challenges involved, like flying over 50 miles from their bases, mostly over the English Channel. Here is Pilot Officer Peter L. Parrott of 145 Squadron to give his thoughts. Quote, "I don't think one had much time to think about the problems. We all hated flying over the sea on one engine. We didn't really have any previous experience on which to base a judgment of any sort, or reason to make any deduction. It was just a fight that was on and we were ready." End quote. During the days that followed, an interesting phenomenon occurred over Dunkirk, and it would play an important role in the later stories of the evacuation. Those stories involved the fact that the ground forces and the sailors involved generally felt that there was not enough fighter cover. Now, of course, those groups would probably never have been satisfied with the fighter protection provided if even a single German aircraft was able to reach the beaches. But there was also the problem that there was sometimes planes in the air, but they were not visible from the ground. Before I read this quote, I will also just say that during the Second World War, differences in altitude were very, very important when it came to airborne combat. Aircraft that were at a higher altitude had significant advantages due to the speed that could be gained by diving down on an enemy, as well as the speed that was lost by any aircraft that was trying to gain altitude. With that fact in mind, here is Pilot Officer H.M. Stephen of the 74th Squadron of the RAF. Quote, "What Dunkirk did for air fighting was that it moved the fighting, which we had always thought we would do from around 7,000 to 10,000 feet, straight to over 20,000 feet in about 4 days. For every time we went over, we said, right, we must be higher than they are, so we'd go up another 4,000 feet. And we would get there, and they would be up 2,000 feet above us. In no time at all, air fighting changed from the traditional pattern where one could see the ground to right on top of where you couldn't see it at all. This is one of the reasons, I'm sure, the Army was often said, where are these fighter pilots? They were there all right, but they couldn't see them," end quote. I love this quote because it gives some insight into the process of evolution that could occur on a day-to-day basis during the Second World War. One side would do one thing, the other side would adapt. And this would happen in many different areas and many different times throughout the war and could cause combat to change drastically, even on a day-to-day basis. In this case, it also robbed the men on the ground from the comforting assurance that the British fighters were in the sky and protecting them. It also introduced another challenge for the pilots because the higher they had to fly, the longer it took them to reach that altitude, and then the shorter the time that they could spend over France. This meant that trying to maintain a fighter presence could only be done by increasing the numbers of sorties the pilots were flying, because the flight time and the number of planes were both fixed numbers, and so the only way you could get more fighters over France was to send pilots more often.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
During the first few days of the evacuations, the war in the air would not hit the level of intensity that it would in the days that followed. This still meant that German and British planes were beating each other almost every single day, and often multiple times per day. Typical of the accounts is this one from Flight Lieutenant J.A. Leithart of 54 Squadron. Quote, "The squadron ran into the biggest cloud of fighters that I'd ever seen so far. They were all Messerschmitt 109s and 110s, with Ju-88s, and there must have been pretty nearly 100 of them. They seemed like a swarm of bees. We went in, however, and tore off a chunk each. My recollections of that show are a bit hazy because we were fighting upstairs and downstairs between 1,000 and 15,000 feet, and I was blacking out fairly often in the pullouts after diving after a Hun. But I'm certain I got 3, and the rest of the squadron wasn't doing too badly because at one time the air seemed to be full of burning aircraft." End quote. I will just throw out a reminder that it's always important to take any information about a pilot's victories with a tremendous grain of salt. Through no real fault of their own, it's very difficult to keep track of exactly who was shooting at who and who was hitting who when the aircraft were, making passes at hundreds of miles an hour at each other, which resulted in destroyed enemy aircraft being attributed to multiple different pilots simultaneously. That's one of the ways in which you get the extremely inflated numbers from pilots about how many enemy aircraft were shot down. Weather was also an important factor during the entire campaign, and so often you get days like the 26th of May, where the British would fly several sorties in the early morning and then have to cancel trips over later in the morning due to cloud cover, before they then resumed them in the early afternoon, only to then cancel them later in the day due to rain. During all of these sorties, of which pilots would fly multiple in one day, whether or not they encountered German aircraft was a complete chance. The general structure of the German attacks was established during the early days of the operations over Dunkirk, with German bombers of all various types attempting to bomb the city of Dunkirk and the British ships that were evacuating soldiers. All the major types of German bombers were here: Dornier 17s, Heinkel 111s, Stukas, Junker 88s, all of them were here. The German fighters were either the ubiquitous Bf-109 as well as the Messerschmitt Bf-110. The 110 was a so-called heavy fighter in that it had 2 engines, which gave it a higher top speed, and it had a crew of 3. It would prove to be very vulnerable to the more nimble British fighters, a situation that would become even more apparent in the months after Dunkirk and in the actions over Britain. This is the account of Flight Lieutenant Ellis of 610 Squadron, who would have a run-in with some Bf-110s, which he refers to as Me-110s. Quote, "On our first patrol over Dunkirk on 27th May, we spotted a lone Heinkel 111, which A Flight attacked, while I, with B Flight, kept a lookout for enemy fighters. The whole of A Flight had a go at the Heinkel, but all except Brian Smith opened fire at too great a range. Flying Officer Smith eventually closed in and claimed it as destroyed, but as we watched, my flight was set on by out of the sun from a clear blue sky by a squadron of Me-110s. For a few minutes, the sky was full of aircraft milling around chasing each other. I pursued a 110 and had no difficulty in turning inside of him. As soon as I opened fire, the rear gunner stopped firing and the aircraft rolled over and dived down vertically. Almost immediately, I chased a second 110 and closed in to about 300 yards. I hit him in the starboard engine, which was on fire, but had to break off when I saw in my mirror another 110 on my tail. By this time, I was 20 miles or so from Dunkirk." End quote. Not every British pilot was as lucky as Ellis was in that quote I just read. And just on the 27th, there would be 18 British fighter aircraft shot down in missions over Dunkirk. However, about half of the fighter pilots that were shot down in these early days of the campaign would be able to bail out of their aircraft and eventually make their way safely to Dunkirk for evacuation. Along with the well-known Hurricanes and Spitfires, the British Defiant turret fighter would also make its presence known over Dunkirk. The Defiant was called a turret fighter because its only armament was a turret mounted behind the cockpit, which was manned by a gunner and had 4 machine guns. The concept of such a fighter was based around the assumption that German bombers would be attacking Britain without fighter escort, making the greater flexibility of the turret a powerful feature which would allow for much easier attacks on German bombers. It was never really designed to operate in an environment with an enemy fighter presence, but they were one of the squadrons available, and there were a lot of German bombers if they could get to them. One day on which they really did get to them was on the 29th, when the Defiant Squadron was able to get in the middle of an attack of Stukas. This was an ideal hunting ground for the Defiants, and a rare situation in which they were able to operate in an environment that they were designed for. They would claim 37 victories, with 18 of them being Stukas just on that day, just on the 29th. But even though they claimed 37 victories, the actual number was probably less than half that. Again, we're dealing with kind of aviation-related inflation there. Regardless of the exact situation for specific squadrons on specific days and their claimed victories versus their actual victories, from May 26th to May 29th can kind of be seen as a period when, in the air at least, both sides could claim some level of success. Both sides lost aircraft, but German bombers were still able to launch their attacks successfully, and British fighters were able to shoot down a good number of German bombers in return. But in the days that followed, the action in the air would further intensify. The Royal Navy was instructed to begin Operation Dynamo for the evacuation of British and French forces a bit before 7 p.m. on May 26th. By this time, in contrast to the extreme focus being placed on Dunkirk by the British, the Germans were already beginning to focus on other operations. For them, the actions in the north had become a mopping-up operation, with British and French counterattacks no longer a real threat. It was really just a matter of time before they were defeated. Either they were destroyed or surrendered. It didn't really matter. This meant that back at German High Command, they were already focusing on Case Red, which would be the attack launched into the rest of France during June. On the administrative side, this meant that command of reducing the British and French forces in the north was handed over to Bach's Army Group B, which had started the war attacking into northern Belgium, while Runestedt's Army Group A, which had come through the Ardennes, and all or most of the German armored divisions were shifted to prepare for future operations. Dunkirk was also not the only area where action was happening at this point in the north, and while history's eyes would be focused on the events in the Dunkirk perimeter, a critical role was played by the German and French forces around the city of Lille. In the areas around the city, the Belgian surrender in the early hours of May 28th had allowed the Germans to trap French forces, and over the next 2 days they would tie down a total of 7 German divisions in their defense of the city, crucial forces that might have prevented the creation of a continuous perimeter around Dunkirk. On the 29th, the resistance around Lille would collapse, with some French forces surrendering while others would manage to escape to the north. The Belgian surrender also caused problems for the defenders around Dunkirk, but they would be able to frantically move some British and French forces to plug the gaps left by the Belgian surrender before the Germans were able to take advantage. During these last days of May, there would still be some actions by German panzer divisions around Dunkirk, but the decision would be made to pull them out of the line in preparation for Case Red. For the German military leaders, this made complete sense, and they made the decision for strictly military reasons. Once they shifted in mindset to the actions in the north being mopping up battles, it seemed pointless to subject the German mobile forces to attrition against a defeated enemy, particularly in ground that was not ideal for the operations of the panzer divisions, which was a lot of the coastal areas, and when another operation loomed in the very near future. The 9th Panzer Division would be the only one that remained in the area around Dunkirk, joined by the infantry of General Kukler's 18th Army, which was pretty exhausted after having been on the move since the start of the campaign. This was one of the reasons that the evacuation would have so much time to kind of proceed, because once a solid perimeter was put in place, it would be difficult for the German infantry to kind of get the men and materiel together to really attack against determined opposition. The perimeter was the weakest on the eastern side due to the Belgian surrender, but it was also in this area that it had kind of the most amount of flexibility. It could give a little more than in some other areas. These problems on the ground would combine with assurances by Goering that the Luftwaffe could destroy the forces in Dunkirk to thrust sort of air operations over Dunkirk into a new level of importance. But the important thing really to remember with this fact is that it was not just because the German military leaders were underestimating the defenders of Dunkirk, or because they were overestimating the power of the Luftwaffe or discounting the possibility of evacuation that the, Operation Dynamo would be so successful, but also because they were very concerned about future operations to defeat France. It was the preparations for Case Red more than anything else that took the panzer divisions away from Dunkirk and moved so much of the German military sort of away from the Dunkirk perimeter at this critical time. Back in London, preparations for the evacuation operations would continue to ramp up on May 26th and the 27th. On the first 2 days of the operation, the collection of soldiers had primarily been done by cross-channel ferries and some armed boarding vessels of the Royal Navy. But it was very clear that these vessels would not be able to get all the troops off the beaches, and so more ships were brought together over the course of the 27th from two different sources. The larger and more important would be an increased number of Royal Navy destroyers, which would be able to get men off of the quays around Dunkirk, and then a call was made on the 27th for the requisitioning of small vessels, which was possible because of a registry that had been put in place of such vessels just in case they were needed by the British Navy. And in the opening days of Operation Dynamo, they were very much needed. And these vessels that were requisitioned on these days would be the little ships, which were on their way to a date with destiny.